Hello! Hello, hello. Right, we must be nearly at the end of this because I can't wait to get onto this Lemony Snickets. I really like this book, the first. Marvellous in Medicine, number 3. Here it is! Cried Mr. Killycranky, rushing into our kitchen. 1 carton of flea powder for dogs and 1 tin of brown shoe polish. George poured the flea powder into the giant saucepan. Then he scooped the shoe polish out of its tin and added that as well. Stir it up, Georgia, stir it up, shouted Mr. Cranky. Give it another boil. We've got it this time, I'll bet we've got it. After Marvellous Medicine number 3 had been boiled and stirred, George took a cupful of it out into the yard to try it on another chicken. Mr. Cranky ran after him, flapping his arms, hopping with excitement. Come on, this is going to be fantastic, it's going to be great. Ooh. Come on, watch us turning an ordinary chicken into a lovely great big one that lays eggs as large as footballs. Oh, I hope you do better than last time, said Mrs. Cranky, following them out. Come on, chicken, said George, holding out a spoonful of medicine number 3. Good chicken, chicken, have some of this lovely medicine. A magnificent black cockerel with a scarlet comb came stepping over. The cockerel looked at the spoon and it went peck. Cock-a-doodle-doo, squawked the cockerel, shooting up into the air and coming down again. Watch him now, cried Mr. Cranky. Watch him grow. Any moment he's going to start getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Ooh. But Mr. Killycranky and Mrs. Cranky and little George stood in the yard staring at the black cockerel. The cockerel stood quite still. It looked as though it had a headache. What's happening to its neck? Mrs. Cranky said. It's getting longer, George said. I'll say it's getting longer, Mrs. Cranky said. For Mr. Cranky for once said nothing. Last time it was his legs, Mrs. Cranky said. Now it's the neck. Who wants a chicken with a long neck? You can't eat a chicken's neck. It was an extraordinary sight. The cockerel's body hadn't grown at all, but the neck was now about 6 feet long. Oh, look at that. Wasn't it my glasses or a hair? The light. All right, George, Mr. Cranky said. What else have you forgotten? I don't know, George said. Oh, yes, you do, Mr. Cranky said. Come along, boy, think. There's probably just one vital thing missing, and you've got to remember it. I put in some engine oil from the garage. Did you have that on your list? Eureka, Mr. Cranky. That's the answer. How much did you put in? 1/2 pint, George said. Mr. Cranky ran to the garage and found another 1/2 pint of oil and some antifreeze. George called after him. I sloshed in a bit of antifreeze. Back in the kitchen, George's Marvellous Medicine number 4. George, with Mr. Cranky watching him anxiously, tipped 1/2 pint of engine oil and some antifreeze into the giant saucepan. Boil it up again, cried Mr. Cranky. Boil it and stir it. George boiled it and stirred it. You'll never get it right, said Mrs. Cranky. Don't forget, you just don't have the same things, but you've got to have exactly the same amounts of these things. And how can you possibly do that? Just keep out of it, cried Mr. Cranky. We're doing fine. We've got it this time. You see if we haven't. This was George's Marvellous Medicine number 4, and when it had boiled for a couple of minutes, George once again carried a cupful of it into the yard. Mr. Cranky ran after him. Mrs. Cranky followed more slowly. You're going to have some mighty queer chickens around here if you go on like this, she said. Dish it out, George, cried Mr. Cranky. Give a spoonful to that one over there. He pointed to the brown hen. George knelt down and held out the spoon with the new medicine in it. Chick, chick, he said. Try some of this. The brown hen walked over and looked at the spoon. Then it went peck. Ouch, it said. Then a funny whistling noise came out of its beak. Watch it grow! Watch it grow! Cried Mr. Cranky. Don't be so sure, said Mrs. Cranky. Why is it whistling like that? Keep quiet! Give it a chance! They stood there staring at the brown hen. It's getting smaller, George said. Look at it, Dad. It's shrinking. And indeed it was. In less than a minute, The hen had shrunk so much it was no bigger than a new hatched egg. It looked ridiculous. Mr. Cranky's not going to be happy. There's still something you've left out, Mr. Cranky said. I can't think what it could be, George said. Give it up, Mrs. Cranky said. Pack it in, you'll never get it right. Mr. Cranky looked very forlorn. George looked pretty fed up too. He was still kneeling on the ground with the spoon in the hand and the cup full of medicine in the other. The ridiculous tiny brown hen was walking slowly away. At that point, Grandma came striding into the yard. From her enormous height, she glared down at the three people below and she shouted, "What's going on around here? Why has anybody brought me my morning cup of tea? It's bad enough having to sleep in the yard with the rats and the mice, but I'll be blowed if I'm going to starve as well. No tea, no eggs and bacon, no buttered toast." "Oh, I'm sorry, Mother," said Mrs. Cranky. "We've been terribly busy. I'll get you something right away." "Let George get it, the lazy little brute!" Grandma shouted. Just then, the old woman spotted the cup in George's hand. She bent down and peered into it. She saw that it was full of brown liquid. "Grandma, Grandma, Grandma, don't do it." It looked very much like tea. "Oh, ho, ho!" she cried. "Ha, ha! So that's your little game, is it? You look after yourself all right, don't you? You make quite sure you've got a nice cup of tea in the morning, but you don't think to bring one out for poor old Grandma. I always knew you were a selfish pig." "No, Grandma," Joe said. "This isn't—" "Don't lie to me, boy. Pass it up here." "No," cried Mrs. Cranky. "No, Mother, don't. That's not for you." "Now you're against me too," shouted Grandma. "Me own daughter trying to stop me having me breakfast, trying to starve me out." Mr. Cranky looked up at the horrid old woman and he smiled sweetly. "Of course it's for you, Grandma. You take it and drink it while it's nice and hot." "Don't think that I won't," Grandma said. "Hand it over, George." "No, no, Grandma," George cried out, pulling the... "You mustn't. You're not to have it." "Give it to me, boy." "Don't," cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's George's Marvellous. Everything's George's round here," Grandma said. "George is this, George is that. I'm fed up with it." She snatched the cup out of a little George's hand and carried it high up out of reach. "Drink it up, Grandma," Mr. Cranky said, grinning. "Lovely tea." "No," the other two cried. "No, no, no." But it was too late. The ancient beanpole had already put the cup to her lips, and in one gulp she swallowed everything that was in it. "Mother," wailed Mrs. Cranky, "you've just drunk 50 doses of George's Marvellous Medicine number 4, and look what one tiny spoonful did to that little brown hen." But Grandma didn't even hear her. Great clouds of steam were pouring out of her mouth, and she was beginning to whistle. "This is going to be interesting," said Mr. Cranky. "Now you've done it," said Mrs. Cranky. "You've cooked the old girl's goose." "I didn't do anything," Mr. Cranky said. "Oh, yes, you did. You told her to drink it." A tremendous was coming from above their head. Steam was shooting out of Grandma's mouth and nose and ears and whistling as it came. "She'll feel better after she's left off a bit of steam," Mr. Cranky said. "She's going to blow up," Mrs. Cranky wailed. "Her boiler's going to bust." "Stand clear," Mr. Cranky said. Quite why George was so alarmed, we don't know. He stood up and ran back a few paces. The jets of white steam kept squirting out of the skinny old hag's head, and the whistling was so high and shrill that it hurt his ears. "Call the fire brigade," said Mrs. Cranky. "Call the police. Man the hose pipes." "Too late," said Mr. Cranky, looking pleased. "Grandma," shrieked Mrs. Cranky. "Mother, run to the drinking tub and put your head under the water." But even as she spoke, the whistling suddenly stopped and the steam disappeared. That was when Grandma began to get smaller. She started off with a head as high as the roof of the house, but now she was coming down fast. Watch this, George, Mr. Cranky shouted, hopping around the yard, flapping his arms. Watch what happens when someone has had 50 spoonfuls instead of one. Very soon, Grandma was back to normal height. Stop, Mrs. Cranky said. That's just right. But she didn't stop. Smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and down and down and down she went. In another half a minute, she was no bigger than a bottle of lemonade. Uh-oh. How do you feel, Mother? Asked Mrs. Cranky anxiously. Grandma's tiny face still bore the same foul and furious expression as it always had. Her eyes, no bigger now than little keyholes, were blazing with anger. How do I feel? She yelled. How do you think I feel? How would you feel if you'd been a glorious giant one minute and suddenly you're a miserable midget? She's still going, cried Mr. Cranky. She's still getting smaller. And by golly, she was. When she was no bigger than a cigarette, Mrs. Cranky made a grab for her. She held her in her hands and she cried. How do I stop her getting smaller still? You can't, said Mr. Cranky. She's had 50 times the right amount. I must stop her, said Mrs. Cranky. I hardly can see her. Catch hold of each end and pull. By then, Grandma was the size of a matchstick and still shrinking fast. A moment later, she was no bigger than a pin, then a pumpkin seed, then. Where is she? Cried Mrs. Cranky. I've lost her. Hooray! Said Mr. Cranky. She's gone. She's disappeared completely, cried Mrs. Cranky. That's what happens to you if you're grumpy and bad-tempered, said Mr. Cranky. Great medicine of yours, George. George didn't know what to think. For a few minutes, Mrs. Cranky kept wandering around with a puzzled look on her face, saying, Mother, Mother, where are you? Where have you gone? Where have you got to? How can I find you? But she calmed down quite quickly, and by lunchtime she was saying, oh, well, I suppose it's all for the best, really. She was a bit of a nuisance around the house, wasn't she? Yes, Mr. Cranky said, she most certainly was. George didn't say a word. He felt quite trembly. He knew something tremendous had taken place that morning. For a few brief moments, he had touched with the very tips of his fingertips the edge of a magic world. Uh-oh, who's that? Grandma. Hey, George! I enjoyed that. Never read it before. Never read it. Enjoyed it. Very good book. So we're now going to get into this. It says here, I'm sorry to say that the book you are holding in your hands is extremely unpleasant. It tells an unhappy tale about 3 very unlucky children. Oh, I can't wait for that. Start that tomorrow. Have a good evening. See you later. Bye.